The last shovel of dirt hit the mound on a Tuesday afternoon, and Oliver Blackwell stood over the grave of everything he had ever loved and decided, with the quiet certainty of a man who has nothing left to lose, that he was finished. He did not weep. He had done his weeping in the dark of the barn 3 nights prior, when the first frost had come down hard and early from the Wyoming mountains and taken the last of his winter wheat before it had a chance to harden. He had stood in that frost and watched the green go gray, watched the stalks bow like penitents before a merciless God, and he had understood then what Tuesday morning would confirm. The wheat was gone. The savings were gone. His wife, Eleanor, had been gone for 14 months. His son, Thomas, just 8 years old, lay beneath the cold earth of the family plot beside the big cottonwood, taken by the fever the previous spring. And now the land itself seemed to be turning its face away from him. He was 31 years old and he felt like 70. The grave he had dug on that Tuesday was not a literal grave, though it might as well have been. He had buried the last of the seed grain he had been hoarding since September, 3 burlap sacks of it, down beneath the frost line in the root cellar, trying to protect it against the cold that had already stolen everything else. But when he had gone down that Tuesday morning with a lantern, he had found that the moisture had gotten in through a crack in the cellar wall, and the grain had rotted, black and wet and useless. He had carried the bags out to the back field and dug a hole and buried them there, because it felt right to give them a proper burial, because they had been his last hope and they deserved that much. He stood over the mound of dark earth, hat in hand, the November wind cutting across the open range with a knife-like efficiency, and he looked out at the 300 acres of his family's ranch and thought about what it meant to be completely and utterly without a future. The Blackwell Ranch, Ridgeline, sat 8 miles south of the town of Harker's Crossing in the Wyoming Territory, in the year 1882. It was good land. His father had broken it from nothing in 1859, had built the house with his own hands from cottonwood timber and river stone, had raised cattle and wheat and 2 sons. Oliver's older brother James had gone north to Montana Territory to try his hand at copper mining and had not written in 3 years. His parents had both passed before Eleanor. So it was just Oliver now, on 300 acres of good land that was slowly breaking him, the way good land sometimes does when the weather turns against a man and the prices at market drop and there is no one left to help him carry the weight of it. He put his hat back on his head and walked back to the house. Inside, the kitchen was cold. He had let the fire go low because he was conserving what wood he had cut, because buying more wood cost money he did not have, because everything cost money he did not have. He sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the ledger that had been sitting open there for 2 days. The numbers in it were simple and brutal. He owed the bank in Harker's Crossing $40 on the land loan that came due in March. He had $11.30 to his name. He had no seed grain. He had 6 head of cattle left from a herd that had once numbered 30, and the cattle were thin from the early frost killing the grazing grass. He had enough food in the house to last perhaps 6 weeks if he was careful. He was not a man who gave up easily. His father had raised him with the stubborn belief that a man worked his way through hard times by working harder, and Oliver had lived by that principle through Eleanor's illness, through Thomas's death, through 2 drought years and 1 flood year, and a cattle sickness that had taken half his herd in the summer of 1881. He had always found a way to keep moving forward. But sitting at that kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in November of 1882, with the wind pressing against the windows and the fire going low, and the ledger showing numbers that could not be argued with, Oliver Blackwell felt the last of his forward momentum drain out of him like water from a cracked bucket. He closed the ledger. He went to bed without eating supper. He lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought that in the morning he would ride into Harker's Crossing and talk to Mr. Aldous Crane at the bank and see about surrendering the deed. He thought that was probably what a sensible man would do. He thought about his father, about what his father would say, and then he thought that his father was dead and could not say anything, and that was that. He slept, and his dreams were gray and quiet, like the frosted fields. He was standing at the kitchen window the next morning, Wednesday, watching the pale winter sunrise color the eastern ridge in shades of pink and orange that were almost cruelly beautiful, a cup of weak coffee growing cold in his hand when he heard it. The sound of hooves on the frozen ground, coming up the main track from the south road. Not one horse but two, and the second one sounded heavier, laden with something. He set his coffee down and went to the door. The woman who rode up to the gate of the Blackwell ranch that Wednesday morning was not what Oliver had been expecting, though he had not been expecting anything at all. She was perhaps 26 or 27 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a practical wide-brimmed hat that had seen considerable weather. She sat her horse the way someone sits a horse who has grown up on horseback, easy and confident, her back straight without being stiff. She was wearing a heavy canvas riding coat over what appeared to be practical working clothes, boots that were worn but well-made, and gloves that had been mended at least twice. Behind her horse she led a sturdy pack mule that was loaded heavily with sacks. Large burlap sacks, tied carefully across the mule's back, 6 of them at least. She pulled up at his gate and looked at him standing in the doorway with his cold coffee and his unshaved face and his 3-day worn clothes, and she looked at him the way a person looks at a situation they have already assessed and made a decision about. "You Oliver Blackwell," she said. Her voice was clear and direct, not unkind but not soft either, the voice of a woman who had learned to make herself heard. "I am," he said. "Good," she said. "I am Kate Kendrick. I bought the Henderson place." Oliver blinked. The Henderson place was the 160-acre homestead parcel that abutted his southern fence line. Earl Henderson had abandoned it in September and ridden east, said he was going back to Ohio, could not take another Wyoming winter. Oliver had not heard that anyone had bought it. "When did that happen?" he said. 3 weeks ago," she said. "Mr. Aldous Crane at the bank handled the papers. I came up from Colorado." She paused, looking at his expression, which he supposed was not particularly welcoming. "I have 6 sacks of winter rye seed grain on this mule. I bought extra in Cheyenne because the man at the seed merchant said the early frost had wiped out most of the fields in this valley. I have enough for my place, and enough left over for yours if you want it." She looked at the fields stretching behind him, reading them the way a farmer reads fields. "You look like you lost your crop." Oliver stood very still in his doorway. He was a man who had just buried his last hope the day before, and now this woman was sitting at his gate on a Wednesday morning with seed grain on a mule and looking at him like the most practical thing in the world was for him to step aside and let her help. He did not know what to say. "I cannot pay for seed grain," he said, because it was true and he was not going to lie about it. "Did I ask you to pay for it?" she said. "No," he said. "No," she agreed. "Move over, Mr. Blackwell. This mule needs water." He moved. He opened the gate and she rode through, and he stood there watching as she dismounted with practiced ease and led both animals toward the trough by the barn. He watched her for a moment, this stranger who had ridden onto his land as though she had been expected, and he felt something move inside his chest that was not quite hope yet but was something in that neighborhood. Something he had not felt in a long time. He went to help her with the mule. They unloaded the sacks in the barn, working mostly in silence. Kate Kendrick handled the heavy sacks without asking for assistance, but did not refuse it when he took the other end. She was strong, clearly used to physical work, and she moved with an efficiency that Oliver found himself noticing. When the mule was unloaded and watered and given some of his meager hay, she stood in the barn doorway and looked at his fields again. "Winter rye goes in before the hard freeze settles permanent," she said. "You have maybe 2 weeks, possibly 3 if the weather holds. Henderson's fields too. If we work the ground right and get the seed in, we can come up with a spring crop that will at least give you something to sell." Oliver said. She looked at him steadily. "I told you I bought the Henderson place. I am your neighbor, and I cannot work 2 properties alone." She said it matter-of-factly, without apology. "I will need help with my acreage too, I'm proposing we work together. You have the equipment. I have the seed. Seems logical. Oliver looked at this woman standing in his barn doorway and thought several things in quick succession. He thought that she was either the most straightforward person he had ever met or the most forward one. He thought that the proposal made a kind of practical sense that was hard to argue with. He thought that she had the most direct gray eyes he had encountered on a human being. "You came all the way from Colorado alone," he said. "I did," she said, without elaboration. "That is a considerable distance." "It is," she agreed. He waited in case she intended to say more. She did not. "All right, Miss Kendrick," he said. "Mrs. Kendrick," she said, and then corrected herself immediately with a brief tightening around her eyes. I am not anymore. Kate is fine." "All right, Kate," he said, and she nodded, and that was how they began. They spent the rest of that Wednesday morning talking about the land. She had her own map of the Henderson property, which she spread on his kitchen table, and she had notes she had made in a small leather notebook, neat handwriting with observations about soil and drainage, and where the water ran in spring. Oliver found himself leaning over the table looking at her notes with genuine interest, because whatever else she was, this woman had done her homework. She had not bought that land on a whim. He made fresh coffee, strong this time, and she accepted a cup without being asked, and they talked about soil preparation and seeding depth and the particular challenges of winter rye in the Wyoming climate. And somewhere during that conversation, Oliver realized that he had not talked to another person in nearly 2 weeks, and that the sound of another voice in his kitchen felt like something he had forgotten he needed. She told him, in her spare and economical way of talking, a little about herself. She had grown up on a farm in Kansas, the daughter of a farming family, had learned everything she knew about the land from her father. She had married at 21. A man named Charles Kendrick, who had been a decent man if not a particularly happy one, and who had died of pneumonia the previous winter in Colorado, leaving her with a small amount of money and a very large question about what to do next. She had decided to head north to Wyoming because the land prices were lower and the territory was still open enough to offer real opportunity. "People thought I was foolish," she said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. "A woman buying land alone, coming north in October." "Were they wrong?" Oliver said. She thought about it, which he appreciated. She was not the kind of woman who gave reflexive answers. "Probably not entirely," she said finally. "It is harder than I anticipated, but I have never in my life gone back from something because it was hard." He believed her completely. Oliver spent that afternoon showing her the boundary fence between his property and hers, and they walked some of the Henderson acreage together, he pointing out things he knew about the land from years of neighboring it. The Henderson house was cold and empty and smelled of abandonment, that particular smell of a place where someone has given up. He watched Kate walk through it with her notebook, making assessments, not flinching from the work ahead of her. There was a broken window in the kitchen that had let the cold in. There was a section of roof over the back bedroom that needed attention. The well cover was rotting and would need to be replaced before spring. Oliver watched her catalog all of these things without complaint and thought that she was either very brave or very determined or both. "You can stay at my place tonight if you want," he said, and then caught himself. "I mean in the house. I can take the barn." She considered him. "That is decent of you," she said. "But I have a tent and I have slept in it from Colorado. I will be fine here." "It is going to get down to 15 degrees tonight," he said. "I have a good bedroll," she said. He thought about arguing. He decided not to. He was already learning, not a woman who changed her mind because someone else thought she should. "There is firewood stacked on the Henderson porch," he said. "Not much, but enough. And if you need anything, I am 8 minutes riding south." "Thank you," she said. And then, as he was turning to go, she said, "Mr. Blackwell." He turned. "I know this must be strange," she said. "A stranger showing up like this. I heard about the frost when I stopped in Harker's Crossing yesterday. The man at the feed store said you had lost your crop. I was not trying to intrude into your situation. I just thought if I had extra seed and you needed seed, that was a problem with a solution." Oliver looked at her in the thin November light, standing in the doorway of the abandoned Henderson house with her breath making little clouds in the cold air, and he felt something in his chest do that thing again, that thing that was in the neighborhood of hope. "Miss Kate," he said, "you showed up the day after I buried what I thought was the last hope I had for this place. You are not an intrusion." "You are," he stopped, because he was not a man who came easily to words of that kind, and because he was not entirely sure what she was yet, only that her arrival felt like something more than coincidence. "I am glad you came," he said finally, simply. She looked at him for a moment, and something in her direct gray eyes softened just slightly. "Get some sleep, Mr. Blackwell," she said. "We have work tomorrow." He rode home in the early dark, smiling without quite realizing he was doing it. The work they did that November was the kind of work that builds something between two people, whether they intend it to or not. They started on the Blackwell fields because they were larger and the soil was better prepared, and they worked from first light to last light every day, breaking the frozen top crust of the fields with Oliver's plow horse and his single-bottom plow, turning the earth to where it was workable, then using the hand seeders to put the rye down at the proper depth. Kate worked alongside him without any suggestion that the physical labor was beneath her or beyond her. She could plow a straight line, and she knew how to handle a horse, and she did not stop for anything except water and the midday meal. Oliver had suggested she eat the midday meal at his house to save time traveling back to the Henderson place, and she had agreed on the practical grounds that it made sense. And so they fell into a routine of working the fields, coming in at noon, eating whatever Oliver had in the house, talking about the afternoon's work, and then going back out. The conversations at noon started as practical ones about farming and gradually became other things. Kate told him more about her family in Kansas, her father and mother and 3 brothers, the particular smell of Kansas wheat in summer. Oliver found himself telling her about his father, about Thomas, about Eleanor, things he had not spoken aloud in a long time, and Kate listened with the full and serious attention of someone who understood loss personally and did not diminish it with easy comfort. She had her own grief, he understood. Her husband Charles had died less than a year ago. She had not come north to escape it exactly, but to find somewhere to put her energy that was forward-facing rather than backward-facing. And Oliver respected that deeply because he understood it, because he had tried to do the same thing himself for the past year and a half without much success. He found himself watching her when he thought she was not looking, the way she moved, purposeful and economical, the way she pushed a loose strand of hair back from her face with the back of her wrist when her hands were dirty, the way she laughed when something genuinely struck her funny, not a polite laugh but a real one, surprised and unguarded, a laugh that made you feel like you had accomplished something. He noticed these things and he felt guilty about noticing them, because it seemed too soon for that, for any of this. And she was his neighbor and his working partner, and he did not want to complicate the most useful arrangement he had been part of in years by making it into something she had not signed up for. So he kept noticing and kept quiet about it, and they worked. They finished seeding the Blackwell fields in 10 days and moved to the Henderson acreage. The Henderson fields were harder, less attended, with more rocks to pull and more drainage problems to work around, and the work there took longer. Oliver came every day to help, and some evenings he would find himself still at the Henderson place after dark, finishing something with Kate by lamplight, and she would offer him coffee and he would stay a while. And the evenings in the Henderson kitchen, which was slowly becoming warm and livable again as Kate made small repairs and improvements, became his favorite part of the day. He fixed the broken window. He told himself he was doing it because it needed doing, and because he was a decent neighbor. He spent a full day on the roof patch, and it was good work, solid work, and when he was done Kate came out and looked at it and said it was well done, and her approval settled over him warm and unexpected. One evening in late November, After the seating was finished and they were sitting at the Henderson kitchen table with the lamp between them and the wind going outside, Kate put her coffee cup down and looked at him with that direct gaze of hers and said, "What were you going to do before I came?" Oliver was quiet for a moment. "Ride into town and talk to the bank about the deed," he said. She nodded slowly. "Give up the land." "Yes." She looked at her coffee cup. "I am glad you did not have time to do that," she said. "So am I," he said. "Kate." He said her name with a particular weight that surprised him, and she looked up at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the lamp flame moved between them. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that I am grateful for all of this, not just the seed grain. He gestured vaguely, meaning everything. The meals and the conversations and the sound of another person in the fields and the way the days had weighed again. You would have done the same," she said. "I hope so," he said. "I would like to think I would." She smiled at him, a real smile, not the brisk working smile she wore during the day, but something quieter and more private. And Oliver thought that if he was not very careful, he was going to fall completely in love with this woman, and that the prospect of that was both the most frightening and the most alive he had felt in a very long time. December came down cold and hard, and they could no longer work the fields, but the seed was in, and that was what mattered. Oliver had found some winter work doing fence repairs for a ranch further south, and Kate had taken in some sewing and mending from women in Harker's Crossing, and they managed. More than managed, actually. They managed the way two people manage when they have each separately been struggling, and have discovered that together the load is somehow lighter than half. He rode over to the Henderson place every few days, and she came to Ridgeline on the days she had business in town and stopped on her way back. They had not talked about what was growing between them, because neither of them was the sort of person who talked about things until they were sure about them, and the winter was not the time for such conversations anyway. There was too much practical work to be done, too much survival to be managed for philosophy, but there were moments. There was the evening he came to help her reinforce the Henderson barn against the weather, and they ended up working by lantern light much later than intended. And when they were finished and standing in the barn, she had looked up at him, and he had looked down at her. And for a long moment the distance between them had been very small, and the lamplight had been very warm, and then they had both stepped back, separately, carefully. And she had thanked him for his help, and he had ridden home in the dark with his heart doing complicated things in his chest. There was Christmas, which he had been dreading, because Christmas had been hard since Eleanor. He came by the Henderson place on Christmas morning with a jar of his mother's preserved peaches that he had been saving, and she was waiting on the porch with a loaf of bread she had baked and a jar of honey, and they exchanged these offerings with a formality that quickly dissolved into something warmer, and they spent the day at his kitchen table with a proper fire going, and he told her about Christmas when he was a boy on this land, and she told him about Kansas Christmases with her brothers. And it was the best Christmas he had had in years, and he knew it was because of her. In January, the real trouble came. Oliver had been aware, in the way one is aware of a storm building on the horizon, that not everything about the situation at Harker's Crossing was uncomplicated. The town had a man in it named Warren Delaney, who ran the livery and a freight operation and had fingers in several other business arrangements in the valley. Delaney was not exactly a bad man, but he was the kind of man who liked to own things, and the Henderson parcel was something he had been intending to acquire at a low price after Henderson left. It was decent land with good water rights, and it abutted the main road in a way that would be useful to someone in the freight business. Delaney had not been pleased when Kate had outbid him for it through the bank, and he had been less pleased as it became clear she intended to actually work it. Oliver had heard the muttering in town, had heard Delaney's comments in the saloon about a woman alone on the land and how long before she came to her senses and sold. Oliver had said nothing, because he was a private man who kept his business to himself, but he had not liked it. In January, Delaney sent a man out to the Henderson property. Oliver did not know this until Kate told him, riding over to his place on a bitter cold afternoon with her jaw set and her eyes sharp. "A man came this morning," she said, standing in his kitchen while he put coffee on. "Said he was from Delaney's outfit. Said Mr. Delaney wanted to make me an offer on the property. Said the price would be fair and the situation sensible." She paused. "He said it would be better for everyone if I took the offer now before spring when things might get more difficult." Oliver turned from the stove. "He threatened you?" "Not directly," she said. "He was very polite about it, but yes." The implication was clear. Oliver was quiet for a moment because he was a man who thought before he spoke. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I was not interested in selling and that he could take that message back to Mr. Delaney," she said. "And then I asked him to leave." "And he left." "He left," she said. "But he took his time about it." Oliver poured the coffee and brought it to the table and sat down across from her. He looked at her face, at the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her eyes, and he thought about Delaney, who was a man who used pressure as a tool as naturally as other men used hammers. He thought about Kate alone on that property 8 miles from town. "You should know," he said carefully, "that Delaney is not the sort of man who takes no for an answer gracefully. He may try again." "I know," she said. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want you to understand that I am saying it because of what it is and not because I think you cannot manage your own affairs." She looked at him, waiting. "You are my neighbor and you have been a considerable help to me, and I would like to return that," he said. "If Delaney or his men come back, I want you to know that you can come here. You are not alone in this." She held his gaze for a moment, and he saw something in her face that moved through and past the usual guard she kept up. "Thank you, Oliver," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name without the Mr. in front of it. He felt the warmth of it settle over him. "Thank you," he said. They rode together into Harker's Crossing 3 days later. Oliver had decided that the most practical thing to do was to make it visible and public that Kate Kendrick had a neighbor who was paying attention. Small towns worked that way. Delaney worked through isolation, through the impression that someone had no one standing with them. Oliver intended to correct that impression. They went to the general store for supplies and he made sure to be seen with her, and they went to the land office together where Kate wanted to check something about her water rights. And when they came out of the land office, Delaney himself was standing on the boardwalk across the street. He was a big man, broad-shouldered in his mid-40s, with the particular kind of good clothing that meant he wanted you to know he could afford it. He looked at them. Oliver nodded. Delaney's expression did not change, but he turned and walked away, and Oliver felt the message had been received. On the ride back, Kate rode beside him and said, "You did not have to do that." "I know," he said. "But you did." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she said, not challenging, genuinely asking. Oliver considered the question. He was a man who liked to be honest when he could, and being honest with himself had become somewhat complicated in recent weeks, since the complications in question involved the woman riding beside him, and the fact that he was fairly sure he was in love with her and had been for some time. He was just not entirely sure what to do about that. "Because it was the right thing," he said, which was true as far as it went. She did not push further, but when they got back to the gate where their roads diverged, she reached across and put her gloved hand briefly on his arm, just for a moment, and said, "I am glad you are my neighbor, Oliver Blackwell." And then she rode south, and he sat his horse watching her go until she was small against the winter landscape. He turned back to his house and thought that he was going to have to say something eventually, because this thing between them was getting to the point where not saying something was its own kind of dishonesty, and he was not a dishonest man. February was brutal, as February in Wyoming often is, but the rye seed was sleeping safe under the frozen ground, and there was nothing to do about the fields but wait. Oliver came across to the Henderson place more often than strict neighborly obligation required, and Kate did not seem to mind, or if she minded, she gave no indication. She was working on the interior of the Henderson house, making it into a real home rather than just a shelter, and she had good taste and practical skills, and the small changes she was making to the place were impressive. He helped her hang a new door on the back room. He helped her repair a section of floor in the kitchen that had gone soft. She made dinner on those evenings, real dinner, not the utilitarian meals of the work days but actual cooked meals, and they would sit at the table and talk well into the evening, about anything and everything, about farming and weather and the territory and what they thought Wyoming might be in 10 years or 20. About books, because it turned out she read considerably and had brought several books from Colorado, and Oliver had his father's collection at the house, and they had strong opinions about what they had read and argued about them with genuine pleasure. He had not argued with anyone about anything pleasant in so long that he had forgotten how good it felt. There was a night in February, the coldest night of the winter, when a storm came down from the north so sudden and so fierce that Oliver had not had time to get back to Ridgeline before the visibility dropped to nothing. Kate would not hear of him trying to ride through the whiteout dark, and she set him up at the kitchen table with a blanket and a pillow and went to her own room, and he lay in the dark of her kitchen and listened to the storm and felt more peaceful than he had any business feeling. In the morning the storm had passed, and the world was white and silent and extraordinarily beautiful. Kate came out of her room already dressed, because she was a practical woman who did not sleep past what was necessary, and she put coffee on, and they stood at the kitchen window together watching the snow-covered world outside and drinking their coffee and not speaking, and it was one of those silences that has a quality of its own, warm and complete, the silence of two people who are comfortable enough together not to need sound to fill the space between them. "I need to tell you something," Oliver said. His voice sounded different to his own ears, quieter, more careful. Kate turned her head and looked at him. "I have been trying to find the right time," he said, "and the right words, and I have been taking too long about both, so I am just going to say it." She waited, coffee cup in both hands, watching him with those gray eyes that he had come to know so well. "I know we have only known each other a few months," he said, "and I know that we both have grief that is not very old, and I know that you came here for practical reasons and not because you were looking for—" He stopped. "I am not trying to make your situation complicated. I am not trying to presume anything, but I would be a liar if I said that what I feel when I am with you is just neighborly goodwill." The kitchen was very quiet. "I love talking with you," he said. "I love working alongside you. I love that you are honest and that you do not require comfort that is not true. I love that you laugh with your whole self and that you know what you are doing and that you came up here alone with seed grain on a mule and told me to move over." He paused. "I have been in love with you since approximately the second week, Kate, and I thought you should know that. And if you would like me to mind my own business and keep to my side of the fence, I will do that, but I could not keep not saying it." He stopped. The storm light coming through the window was white and clean and perfectly still. Kate set her coffee cup down on the windowsill with great deliberateness. She looked at him, that long direct look of hers, and he held it, because he had said what he'd said, and there was nothing to do now but hold it. "Oliver," she said, and the way she said his name was different. He had noticed that she said his name differently at different times, the way the same word can carry different weights, and right now she said it with a particular softness that made his heart feel very full and somewhat precarious. "I did not come here looking for this either," she said. "I thought I was coming here for land, and for something to do with my hands and my grief. I thought I was coming here to be independent and practical, and to prove to myself and everyone else that I could manage." She took a breath. "And then I met you, and you were standing in your doorway looking like a man who had been carrying the whole world alone for too long, and I thought you were probably the most stubborn and most decent man I had run into in some time." He almost smiled. "I have been trying not to feel what I feel," she said. "Because it seemed too soon, and because I did not want to assume, and because I was not sure you—" She stopped, and for the first time since he had known her she looked slightly uncertain, and he found that uncertainty more endearing than anything else about her, which was saying something. "I have had considerably similar thoughts," he said. "Yes," she said. "I can see that." And now she did smile, that real unguarded smile, and he thought he would do a great many things to keep seeing that smile. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand, which was warm from the coffee cup, and she let him take it, and her fingers closed around his, and they stood there at the window with the white Wyoming morning all around them, and it was the simplest and most complete thing Oliver Blackwell had felt in 4 years. They stood like that for a while, watching the snow. Then Kate said, "You should probably go check on your cattle." He laughed. She was entirely right. He kissed her hand before he let it go, which surprised them both slightly, and then he put on his coat and hat and went out into the white morning. Spring came slowly and gloriously, the way Wyoming spring does when you have been waiting for it through a hard winter, arriving first in small signs and building toward the unmistakable green that means the world is turning toward life again. When the rye came up in Oliver's fields in March, both of them stood at the fence and watched the green pushing through the dark earth, and Kate's eyes were bright, and Oliver felt such a profound relief that he had to breathe through it carefully. The Henderson fields came up 2 weeks later, and they were good too, strong and even, a solid stand of winter rye that would not make anyone rich but would make the spring viable, would make the bank payment, would make the next season possible. They worked the spring together, the two properties as a shared project, and the arrangement was so natural and so functional that Oliver began to think about it in a way he had been circling around all winter. They were doing the work of one farm together across 2 properties. There was an obvious logic to that, and the obvious logic had an obvious conclusion, and he thought about that conclusion quite a bit. They went to town together on a Saturday in April for supplies, and on the way back with the wagon loaded with feed and goods and the afternoon sun making the Wyoming hills gold, Oliver said, "I want to ask you something." Kate looked at him from under her hat brim. She had gotten good at reading the register of his voice, he knew, just as he had gotten good at reading hers. She knew this was something deliberate. "All right," she said. "I want to ask you properly," he said. "Which means I want to do it right and not on a wagon seat on a dirt road." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "Oliver." "Yes. I am going to ask you to ask me anyway," she said. "Because I have been waiting for a while, and I would rather know than have to wait for the right setting." He looked at her, this woman who had ridden onto his land with seed grain and practical sense, and had saved him from himself, who had put her hand on his that February morning, and changed the direction of his life, and he thought that she deserved better than a wagon seat on a dirt road, and also that she was completely right that waiting was foolish. He pulled the wagon to a stop. They were on the ridge above his property, and from here you could see both the Blackwell fields and the Henderson fields stretching below, the rye green and bright in the spring afternoon. He turned on the seat to face her properly. "Kate Kendrick," he said, "I'm a man who almost gave up on this land and on everything connected to it, and you rode in and refused to let me. You brought seed grain and good sense in yourself, and I have spent the best months of my life since I can remember because of it. I am 31 years old and I have had considerable grief in my life, and I would very much like the next part of my life to be with you in it." He paused. "I would be deeply honored if you would consider marrying me." Kate sat very still for a moment. The spring wind moved her hair, and below them the green fields shifted like water. "Yes," she said, "just that." Direct and certain and completely like her. He reached out and took her face in his hands and kissed her right there on the wagon seat on the dirt road above his fields, and it was the most right thing he had done in years, and she kissed him back with the same straightforward certainty with which she did everything. And the April sun was warm, and the Wyoming hills were green, and Oliver Blackwell, who had buried his last hope on a Tuesday, was very much alive on this particular spring afternoon. They were married in June of 1883. The ceremony was small, performed by the traveling Methodist minister who came through Harker's Crossing every 6 weeks. in the small white church that had been built by the town's first settlers 15 years prior. Kate wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool she had brought from Cheyenne on one of her supply trips, a practical dress in the sense that she had made it to be worn again rather than only once, but it was beautiful nonetheless, simply cut and fitting her well, and Oliver thought she was the finest thing he had ever seen standing in that church. Half the town came, which surprised them both slightly, because they were both private people who had not thought they made much of an impression on Harker's Crossing. But ranching people understood what the two of them had done that winter, understood the particular courage and stubbornness of keeping land through bad times, and the community turned out in the way small communities turn out for things that feel like victories. The notable exception was Warren Delaney, who was not present and who had, in the months since his man had visited Kate, seemed to recalibrate his position. Oliver was not sure whether it was the public nature of his support for Kate through the winter, or simply Delaney's practical acknowledgement that two properties working together were harder to pressure than one alone. But the freight man had let the matter drop and had been, if not warm, at least outwardly civil in the rare moments their paths crossed. Oliver had thought it would be wise to have a direct conversation with Delaney. He had ridden to Harker's Crossing and found the man at his livery, and said simply that he and Miss Kendrick were to be married and would be farming both properties and intended to stay. And he said it in the way he said most things, plainly and without aggression, but also without any opening for negotiation. Delaney had looked at him for a long moment and then had extended his hand and said that he wished them well, and Oliver believed that was probably the end of it, and so it proved to be. The wedding celebration was at the Blackwell house, because Ridgeline was the larger of the two properties and had the room for it, and because Oliver had spent 2 weeks cleaning and repairing and making it as fine as he could manage. Several of the women from town brought food, and someone brought a fiddle, and the evening turned into something warmer and larger than either of them had anticipated, with dancing on the porch under the June stars and laughter, and the particular warmth of a community reminding itself of its own togetherness. Late in the evening, when many of the guests had gone and the remaining ones were sitting in small groups talking quietly, Oliver found Kate standing at the edge of the porch looking out at the dark fields, and he came to stand beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, which was something she had started doing in the spring, and which he found gave him a deep and steady happiness. "How does it feel?" he said. She thought about it because she always thought about things. "Like a beginning," she said, "a real one." She turned her head to look up at him. "I keep thinking about last November, about the fact that I almost stayed in Colorado for another winter." "What changed your mind?" he said. He had not asked this before. She smiled slowly. "There was a man at the land office in Denver who had information about the Henderson property," she said. "He said a man named Blackwell ran the neighboring ranch and that the Blackwell family had worked that land for 20 years. He said the soil was good and the water was reliable and the country was hard but fair." She paused. "He made it sound like a place worth going to." "He was right," Oliver said. "Yes," she said, "about most of it." He kissed the top of her head. "About all of it," she said quietly to the dark. They decided, after the wedding, to work both properties but to live at Ridgeline, which was the stronger house and had the larger barn. The Henderson property they would farm for crop, and the Ridgeline land they would run mixed, some crop and some cattle, building the herd back up slowly. It was a sensible plan, the kind of plan that two sensible people make when they put their minds together, and they were both good at the kind of patient, long-term thinking that farming required. They hired a hand in July, a young man of 20 named Samuel Birch, who had come up from Texas looking for work, and who proved to be one of those rare people who was good at almost everything he turned his hand to. Samuel was quiet and hardworking and had a gift with horses and cattle, and within a month of his arrival Oliver considered him indispensable, and Kate had decided he was something like a younger brother, which Samuel seemed to find both slightly embarrassing and genuinely appreciated. Samuel had his own history, which he did not talk about much except in small pieces, but Oliver understood from those pieces that the young man's family had been subject to considerable difficulty in Texas, the kind of difficulty that the territory's Reconstruction troubles had laid on black families across the South, and that Samuel had come north in part because Wyoming offered, if not fairness exactly, at least a certain indifference. Oliver ran his land on the principle that a man was worth what he did, and that working together was the most reliable path through hard times. He paid Samuel fairly and worked beside him, and the arrangement suited them all. The summer of 1883 was the kind of summer that made a person forgive Wyoming for its winters. The rye harvest came in strong, not spectacular but solid, enough to clear the bank debt and put something aside for seed and winter expenses. They sold the rye at market in August, and Oliver stood at the bank and paid Aldous Crane the $40 he owed and watched Crane record the payment with great satisfaction. Crane, who was not a bad man despite being a banker, had also been at the wedding, and he looked at Oliver across the desk and said, "That wife of yours, Mr. Blackwell, she is a sensible woman." "She is," Oliver agreed, with the particular pride of a man whose judgment has been confirmed. In September, Kate told Oliver she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning with the same directness with which she told him most things, standing at the stove with her coffee. She said, "I believe you are going to be a father again in April," and then she watched his face. He stood very still for a moment. He thought about Thomas, about the particular grief of that loss, the grief that never entirely went away. He thought about being a father to another child with the knowledge of how fragile that could be. And then he looked at Kate, who was watching him with those steady gray eyes, who knew about Thomas, who knew about all of it, and he thought about the fact that she was the strongest person he knew. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and put his arms around her carefully, as if she might break, and then less carefully when she made a quiet, impatient sound against his shoulder that told him she was not fragile and he should hold her properly. "April," he said, into her hair. "April," she confirmed. He held her for a long time in the kitchen, with the morning coming through the windows and the fields golden outside. The pregnancy was, by Kate's assessment, not something that required altering the basic structure of her life, at least not immediately. She continued to do everything she had done before, the farm work and the household management and the endless series of decisions that running 2 properties required, with the adjustment that Oliver became quietly and somewhat desperately overprotective in a way that she found alternately touching and exasperating. "I am pregnant," she told him one afternoon in October when he had come running from the barn because she was lifting a feed sack, not made of glass. "I know that," he said, taking the feed sack from her. "Then stop looking at me like I am about to shatter," she said. "I am not able to stop looking at you like that," he said honestly. "I am working on it." She looked at him and then something shifted in her face and she put her hand on his arm. "I know," she said more quietly. "I know why you do it, but Oliver, I am well, everything is well." He put his hand over hers. "I know," he said, "I know." He was afraid, and she knew he was afraid, and she let him be afraid while also being firm about living her life, which was exactly right. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was much milder than the previous one, which felt like a mercy from the universe. The fields were resting under a moderate snow cover, the cattle were in decent condition, and the house at Ridgeline was warm and full of the particular domestic quality that a lived-in home accumulates, the smell of cooking and wood smoke, and the presence of 2 people who are comfortable in each other's company. Kate spent some of the winter months teaching herself to read German, having come across a German grammar that had been in the collection of books Oliver's father had left. Oliver watched this with great amusement and some admiration, as she worked her way through the grammar with the same methodical stubbornness she applied to everything else. "Why German?" he asked. "'Cause there are German farming manuals that have not been translated," she said, not looking up. There is one on soil management in cold climates that someone at the agricultural extension in Cheyenne told me about. He laughed. She looked up and saw him laughing and smiled despite herself. They had long evenings that winter, with Samuel occupying the small room they had added onto the barn the previous fall, which gave him proper shelter and gave them the house to themselves, which was appreciated. They read to each other in the evenings, and they talked, those long rambling conversations that have no particular destination but are made up of everything that matters. And Kate grew rounder and warmer. As the winter progressed and Oliver thought he had never loved anything as much as he loved coming in from the cold to find her at the kitchen table with her German grammar or her knitting or her accounts book, her hair down for the evening, looking up at him with that private smile. They talked about names, about whether to tell Kate's family in Kansas, which they did by letter, receiving a warm and enthusiastic response from her father, and a somewhat overwhelming set of letters from all three of her brothers, about what kind of person they hoped the child would be, which turned into a conversation about what they hoped they were as parents, what they wanted to pass on, and what they were relieved to leave behind, and it was one of the most honest conversations Oliver had ever had. "I want them to know this land," he said, "really know it, the way my father taught me to know it, not just as a place but as a living thing you are in relationship with." "I want them to know how to work," Kate said, "and how to rest. I never learned how to rest properly. I do not want to pass that on." "You are learning," he said. She gave him a look. "I am practicing," she said, under protest. He was still smiling about that when he fell asleep. Their son was born on the 7th of April, 1884, during a week of warm and astonishing spring weather that made the whole territory feel like a gift. The birth was attended by a woman named Margaret Holt, who served as midwife to most of the ranches in the valley, a competent and no-nonsense woman in her 50s, who had delivered most of the children born in the Harker's Crossing area for the past 20 years. Oliver spent the hours of the labor in a state of controlled terror, occupying himself by doing every useful thing he could think of, and then doing several useless things. Samuel Birch found him at one point rearranging the tool wall in the barn for the third time and said, with the careful tact of a young man trying very hard, "She is going to be fine, Mr. Blackwell." "Yes," Oliver said, and moved a hammer from one hook to another. But Margaret Holt came to the barn door at 2:30 in the afternoon and said, "Come see your boy." And Oliver walked into his own house on legs that were not entirely steady and found Kate sitting up against the pillows looking exhausted and luminous and very much herself, and in her arms was a small and emphatic and outraged infant who was making his opinion of the world clearly audible. "He has your stubbornness," Oliver said, not entirely coherently. Kate made a sound that was half laugh and half something else entirely. "Come here," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and Kate put the baby in his arms and Oliver held his son for the first time and thought of Thomas, the way he always would, the way that grief was part of this, stitched into the fabric of it rather than erased by it. He thought of Alina. He thought of his father and the land outside, green in the spring afternoon. He thought of a Tuesday in November when he had buried what he thought was the last of everything, and a Wednesday morning when a woman had ridden up to his gate with seed grain on a mule and changed the direction of his entire life. "What do we call him?" Kate said, watching his face. "Robert," Oliver said, which was the name they had settled on his father's name. "Robert James Blackwell." The middle name was for his brother James, somewhere in Montana, whom he had written to with the news of his marriage and who had, eventually, written back with something that was recognizable as warmth filtered through a long habit of distance. "Robert James," Kate said, trying it. She nodded. "Yes, that suits him." Robert James Blackwell was, from the beginning, a child of considerable character. He had his mother's gray eyes and his father's dark hair, and what appeared to be a combination of both their stubborn temperaments that made his first year of life quite eventful. He was curious and determined, and very loud when things did not proceed according to his expectations, which Oliver found privately hilarious and Kate found exasperating in the self-recognizing way. "He got that from you," she told Oliver, when Robert at 8 months old screamed with extraordinary volume because he had been placed on the floor when he wanted to be carried. "The determination is from you," Oliver said. "The volume might be mine." "The volume is absolutely from you," she said. And then they both laughed, which woke the baby, which resulted in more volume, and that was the first year of Robert's life in Small. The ranch at Ridgeline continued to build itself back to what it had been in Oliver's father's time, and then beyond it. They added cattle in 1884 and again in 1885, purchasing carefully, rebuilding the herd with the methodical patience they brought to everything. The rye on the Henderson land produced well for 3 consecutive seasons, and they rotated in some oats, and in 1886 planted the first of what became a small but productive apple orchard on the south-facing slope that Oliver's father had always said was good orchard land, but had never gotten around to planting. Kate's German paid off. She found the soil management manual through an agricultural society in Cheyenne and worked through it over the winter of 1885, implementing several of its recommendations the following spring with results that she recorded carefully in her notebook and shared, in a letter, with the editor of a small agricultural journal in Cheyenne, who wrote back and asked if she would submit an article, which she did, and which was published, to Oliver's enormous pride and her own quiet satisfaction. "A published author," he said, holding the journal. "An agricultural article in a small publication," she said, not looking up from her mending. "A published author," he repeated firmly, and she smiled at her mending. Samuel Birch stayed. He had not, after the first year, shown any indication of moving on, and Oliver had not encouraged him to, because a good working hand was worth a very great deal, and Samuel was better than that. In 1885, Samuel had met a young woman named Clara from a homestead family 15 miles north, and the courtship had proceeded with a careful dignity that Oliver recognized from his own experience. And by 1886, Samuel and Clara were married and living in a small house they had built on the north end of the Ridgeline property, an arrangement that suited everyone. The valley around Harker's Crossing was growing, slowly filling in as more homesteaders came through in the mid-1880s, people coming west with the railroad as the Union Pacific expanded its reach and made the territory more accessible. Oliver and Kate knew most of their neighbors by name within a few years, and the community that had been loose and scattered when Kate first arrived had thickened into something with more coherence, more mutual support, the kind of community that makes hard places livable. There were still hard times. There was a late frost in May of 1886 that caught the oat crop and cost them a season's income, and Oliver felt the familiar cold tightening of financial worry, but it was different now because he was not alone in it. Kate sat with him at the ledger and they worked through it together, found the adjustments, tightened where they needed to tighten, found the path through, and that was how it was done. Together. Warren Delaney, who had been a source of some concern in Kate's first winter, had receded into the simple fact of being a neighbor in a shared valley. He had married a woman from Laramie, which seemed to have improved his general temperament, and his freight business had expanded in ways that kept him occupied enough that he had apparently lost interest in the Henderson parcel, or perhaps had simply accepted that some things were settled. Oliver bore him no ill will. He had been a man who wanted things that belonged to other people, and he had eventually moved on, and that was the best outcome available. In the fall of 1886, Kate's father came to visit from Kansas. He was a tall, spare man in his late 50s named Harold, who had the same direct gaze his daughter had but combined with a deliberateness of movement that suggested a man who had been farming for 30 years and had come to terms with the pace of the world. He had traveled alone, his wife having died 2 years prior, and he stayed 3 weeks at Ridgeline. Oliver had been somewhat uncertain about this visit, in the way of a man being assessed by a father, though Kate assured him repeatedly that her father was not the assessing kind. She was mostly right. Harold Thorne spent the first day looking at the land and the cattle and the fields with professional interest, asked Oliver a series of very direct questions about the farming operation and the finances with the thoroughness of a man who had taught his daughter everything she knew and wanted to see if the investment had been well applied, and then seemed to reach some internal conclusion, because after that he simply helped. He got up with Oliver and Samuel each morning and worked, and in the evenings he told stories about Kate as a child that Oliver treasured, and he played with Robert, whom he referred to as a good deal of boy, which Robert seemed to find appropriate. On the last evening of Harold's visit, sitting on the porch with the autumn dark settling around them and Kate inside putting Robert to bed, Harold looked out at the ridgeline land and said, "She did right coming here." "I believe so," Oliver said. "She told me about that first winter," Harold said. "You and the seed grain in the fields. She told me you were about to give it up." "I was," Oliver said. Harold nodded slowly, the way of a man confirming something he had suspected. "She never did like to see a good thing go to waste," he said. Oliver was quiet for a moment. "I am glad she did not." "So am I," Harold said. He paused. "She is happy. You can see it in her. She has a particular kind of quiet when she is happy, different from just being content. She had that quiet sometimes as a child when she was doing something she loved. I have not seen it since before Charles died." He stopped. "She has it now." Oliver sat with that for a moment, the weight and gift of it. "I love her," he said. It was simple and complete. Harold looked at him with the direct eyes his daughter had inherited. "I know that," he said. "Any fool could see it." He rose from his chair, knees cracking. "Good night, Oliver. Good night, Harold." He stayed on the porch after Harold went inside in the autumn dark, listening to the land settle into night sounds, the cattle shifting, the distant sound of the creek, the wind in the cottonwoods by the family plot. He thought about the graves under that tree, his father and mother and Thomas and Alina, and he thought about them with the particular combination of grief and gratitude that had become his way of carrying them, grief for who they were and gratitude for what they had given him. Kate came out a few minutes later and sat in the chair beside him. "He likes you," she said. "I know," he said. "He told me I was not a fool." She laughed quietly. "From my father that is practically a declaration of love." He reached across and took her hand in the dark and she let him, and they sat on the porch of the house his father had built in the valley that had been his family's for 20 years, and the stars came out in the deep Wyoming sky, and the land was theirs and the night was quiet. "Kate," he said. "Yes," she said, knowing from the register of his voice that this was something real. "I think about November of 1882 sometimes," he said. "About what it would have been like if you had stayed in Colorado for another winter, if you had waited until spring to buy the Henderson place. I think about it too," she said. "And I think about the fact that I was about to go to the bank," he said. "I had decided. One more morning, that was all, and then I would have ridden in." "I know," she said. "We almost missed each other," he said. "Almost," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "I am grateful every day that we did not." She turned her hand in his, lacing their fingers together. "So am I," she said. "For all of it, even the hard parts, the winter and the worry and Delaney and the frost. All of it was the thing that brought us to here." "Yes," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Robert is going to want to sleep with us tonight," she said. "He could tell his grandfather was leaving tomorrow and he gets strange before departures." "He has your perceptiveness," Oliver said. "And your sentimentality," she said, "which he absolutely did not get from me." He smiled. She was right that he was sentimental. He had not always admitted it, but Kate had drawn it out of him, the way she drew most things out of him, through the patient application of being someone worth being honest with. The spring of 1887 brought with it a warm abundance that the valley had not seen in several years. Rain at the right times and sun at the right times, the land yielding generously, and Oliver found himself standing in his fields in late May with that deep satisfaction that only a farmer knows, the satisfaction of watching a living thing respond to care and attention. The apple trees on the south slope had grown well in their first 2 years. They would not bear for another year or two, but they were healthy and full of leaf and promised something worth having. Oliver had come to think of the orchard as a particular legacy, something planted not for immediate return but for the long arc of things. Kate was expecting again, due in the late summer. She had told him in February, early morning, same kitchen, same directness as the first time, and he had held her with considerably less terror than the first announcement, though the careful watchfulness he felt during her pregnancies would probably never entirely go away, and she had made her peace with that. This time it was a daughter. Born in August of 1887, on a warm and golden afternoon, dark-haired like Robert but with Oliver's brown eyes, and as became apparent in the first hours of her life, a temperament that combined the best and most complicated qualities of both her parents into something that was already, clearly, entirely herself. They called her Eleanor Alice Blackwell. The Eleanor was for Oliver's wife, which had felt right and important from the beginning, and which Kate had proposed, which was one of the things about her that he found most extraordinary, her generosity toward the history he carried. Alice was for Kate's mother, who had been Alice Thorne and who was 2 years gone. Eleanor Alice, Kate said, holding her daughter for the first time, and there was something in her voice when she said the name that Oliver understood completely, the acknowledgement of those who came before, the naming as a way of carrying them forward. Yes, he said. Eleanor Alice was a quieter child than Robert had been, which was a significant blessing in purely logistical terms, but she was no less determined and no less herself. She watched everything. Oliver caught her, at 9 months old, watching him from her blanket on the kitchen floor with an expression of such focused assessment that he had laughed out loud. Robert, who was 3 when Eleanor was born, responded to his sister with the mix of fascination and suspicion that firstborn children have toward newcomers, which Kate handled with the practical equanimity she brought to everything. And within 6 months, Robert had decided that his sister was a satisfactory addition and could stay. He carried her around with the proprietary pride of someone who has decided they own something, which Oliver found both endearing and slightly concerning, but Samuel Birch, who had become a kind of uncle in the children's lives, thought was perfectly normal. Samuel and Clara had a child of their own now, a boy named Joseph born in the spring of 1887, a few months before Eleanor, and Joseph and Robert were close in age and growing up together on the ranch in the way of children who are not technically brothers, but are brothers in all the ways that matter for childhood. The years rolled on, and they were good years. There were still hard winters and difficult seasons. There was a drought in 1889 that tested everyone in the valley. There was a period in 1890 when beef prices dropped so sharply that Oliver had to make hard decisions about the herd size that cost them what would have been 2 years of growth. There were illnesses and worries and all the ordinary difficulties of raising children and running land and living a life that required constant attention. But there were also the other things, the things that constitute a life rather than just the problems in it. There was the summer evening when Robert, at 5 years old, caught his first trout in the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property, and held it up with an expression of such pure, astonished triumph that Oliver had to sit down on the creek bank, because he was laughing too hard to stand. There was the afternoon when Eleanor, at 4, stood in the middle of the kitchen garden and informed her parents that she intended to grow a larger garden than this one, and that they had not used the space properly, an assessment which was both completely accurate and completely Kate. There were the evenings after the children were in bed, the quiet hour Oliver and Kate kept for themselves, with the lamp on the table between them and the house settling around them, talking or reading or simply being in the same room in the particular piece of a long partnership. There was the way Kate still, after years, occasionally touched his arm just briefly when she passed behind him, the same gesture she had made that day in Harker's Crossing after the land office, and he always felt it with the same warm immediacy as the first time. They went to Kansas in the summer of 1888, the whole family making the journey to visit Harold Thorne, who was slower now but still farming, still working his fields at 60, proud and stubborn, and delighted by his grandchildren. Kate's brothers were all there, loud and warm, filling Harold's house with the particular chaos of grown men returning to the house they grew up in, and Oliver watched Kate with her family and saw the particular pleasure she took in being a daughter and a sister, a pleasure she did not often have the chance for. Harold held Robert and Alina on his knee on the porch in the Kansas evening and told them about the land, about what the land was and what it gave back to you if you cared for it properly. And Oliver sat a little apart and listened and thought about how those words were an inheritance, the same inheritance Kate's father had passed to her, and that had, in a circuitous and remarkable way, brought her north to Wyoming with seed grain on a mule to save a man who had almost given up. He told Harold that, on the last evening of the visit, sitting on the same Kansas porch while everyone else was inside, Harold listened with the stillness of a man who has learned that patience is how you hear things properly. When Oliver finished, Harold was quiet for a moment and then he said, "The grain was just grain. It was an excuse to ride up and see if the land was worth what she hoped it was." Oliver blinked. She had been watching the Wyoming Territory land prices for 2 years, Harold said, a slight smile at the corner of his mouth. She had written to the land office in Cheyenne 3 times before she bought the Henderson place. She had letters from 3 different men in the valley saying it was good land. He paused. One of those letters was from a man named Crane at the bank, who mentioned that the neighboring Blackwell ranch was a strong property run by a capable man who had come on hard times but had good land and good stock. Oliver looked at him. "She went because of the land," Harold said. "But I think she went knowing that the man on the neighboring property might be worth knowing." He shrugged, with the ease of a man presenting information that he considers self-evident. Kate never did anything without knowing what she was riding toward. Oliver sat with this for a while. Then he said, "Did she know she was going to tell me to move over?" Harold laughed outright, a big genuine laugh that Oliver had not heard from him before. "Probably not that part," he said. "That part she probably figured out on the way." Oliver thought about that all the way back to Wyoming on the train, watching the landscape change from Kansas Flat to Colorado mountains to Wyoming hills, with Robert asleep against his shoulder and Kate opposite him reading to Alina from a picture book. And he thought about how a life was made up of the things that almost did not happen, and how the measure of a good life was not the absence of difficulty, but the presence, through difficulty, of something worth coming home to. Wyoming was that. Kate was that. He reached across the train car and touched Kate's hand, and she looked up from the book and he smiled at her. And she smiled back with the private smile, the one that was just his, and Robert stirred against his shoulder and Alina said, "More story, Mama," and Kate went back to the book. They arrived back at Ridgeline on a late summer evening, the ranch sitting in the last of the day's gold light, the apple trees full and heavy with their first real crop, the fields tidy and rested, the house with its river stone foundation and cottonwood walls solid and warm against the Wyoming evening. Oliver stood at the gate with his sleeping son on his shoulder and watched Kate carry Alina up the porch steps and push open the door of the house, and the lamplight inside spilled out gold and warm against the gathering dusk, and he thought that this was what it looked like when a man got to keep something. He followed his family inside and closed the door. The years between 1888 and the early 1890s were years of steady building. The apple orchard came into full production in 1890 and proved to be everything Oliver's father had predicted that South Slope could produce, the apples coming in heavy and sweet, so good that the general store in Harker's Crossing began selling them, and eventually they were shipping small quantities to the market in Cheyenne. Kate had taken to the orchard with particular passion, had read everything she could find about apple cultivation, had corresponded with orchardists in Colorado and in the Midwest, and the trees responded to her attention the way everything responded to Kate's attention, which was by doing considerably better than expected. Robert grew into a boy who was deeply interested in everything. He followed his father around the ranch with questions that Oliver answered as fully as he could, and that Kate answered with a thoroughness that made Oliver realize all over again how much she knew, which continued to be considerable. At 7, Robert could already identify most of the grasses on the property and had strong opinions about the cattle, could read better than Oliver had at 10, had Kate's facility with numbers and Oliver's capacity for the kind of patient physical work that a ranch required. Eleanor at 5 was a different kind of person, interior and observant where Robert was outward and expansive. She drew pictures in a little book Kate had gotten her from Cheyenne, careful detailed pictures of animals and plants and people, and she had a memory for faces and names, and the particulars of people that was sometimes slightly eerie. She also had already the bones of her grandmother Eleanor's name, the name she carried, something of that earlier Eleanor in the shape of her face that Oliver noticed sometimes with a complicated feeling, grief and love so thoroughly mixed they were not separable. In 1892, they built an addition to the house, 2 more rooms on the east side that would give the growing family space and give Kate a proper room for her books and papers and accounts, which had been sharing space with the main bedroom in a way that had become increasingly impractical. Oliver built most of it himself with Samuel's help, river stone for the foundation and milled lumber for the walls, because the sawmill that had opened in Harker's Crossing 4 years prior made good lumber affordable, and the addition went up in the late spring before the farming season got fully underway. Kate designed the rooms with her usual thorough practicality, thought about light and storage, and how people would actually move through the space, and the result was 2 rooms that felt like they had always been part of the house. Her room, which Oliver never quite stopped thinking of as the book room though it served several purposes, had a window that looked south over the Henderson land, which was to say her original land, the land she had come north to claim, and she sat in that window sometimes in the evenings with a book or her correspondence, and Oliver would pass the doorway and see her there and feel, in the most fundamental and uncomplicated way, that everything was right. A letter came from Oliver's brother James in the autumn of 1892, a longer and warmer letter than the occasional brief communications James had sent over the years. James had left the copper mining, had married a woman named Helen in Montana Territory, had 2 children, a boy and a girl. He was ranching now, had found a piece of land in the Flathead Valley that suited him, and he was, reading between the lines of his brother's characteristic understatement, happier than he had been in years. He wanted, the letter said, to come south and visit, to see the old place. Oliver wrote back and said, "Come whenever you are ready. The house has more room now." James and Helen came in the spring of 1893 with their children, 11-year-old Thomas, named for the brother who was in the ground beneath the cottonwood tree, and 8-year-old Mary. Oliver met them at Harker's Crossing and drove them out to Ridgeline in the wagon, and James sat on the wagon seat and looked at the land as they came up through the valley and did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "You kept it." "I did," Oliver said. James was quiet again. "I was not sure you would." "After Eleanor, after the boy, I almost did not," Oliver said. He told James about November of 1882, about the buried grain, about the Tuesday and the Wednesday and the woman who had ridden up with seed on a mule and told him to move over, and James listened with his eyes on the land, and by the time Oliver was finished, they were pulling up to the gate of Ridgeline and Kate was on the porch with Robert and Eleanor, and James looked at his brother's wife and said, "Well, she sounds about right for you." "She is," Oliver said. The visit was 10 days, and they were good days. The house full of the particular warmth of family reunited, of children growing up together even briefly, of adults talking well into the nights about the lives they had made in this broad and sometimes merciless and often magnificent country. James and Oliver walked the property together one morning and visited the graves under the cottonwood, standing together in the quiet with their hats in their hands, and it was a grief shared that was somehow lighter than grief carried alone, and Oliver thought that was what family was for. Helen and Kate, who had worried separately about whether they would get on, got on immediately and thoroughly, recognizing each other as women of similar substance, and by the third day of the visit they were deep in conversation about things that had nothing to do with their husbands, which Oliver found entirely satisfying. When James and his family left to go back north, James shook Oliver's hand at the wagon and said, "I should have written sooner. I should have come back sooner." "Yes," Oliver said, because it was true. "But you are here now." James nodded. He looked at the house, at the fields behind it, at the orchard on the south slope, green and full in the spring morning. "Father would be pleased," he said. "I think so," Oliver said. They wrote more often after that, he and James, real letters, not just the occasional note of existence. It was something else restored. The summer of 1893 was the summer of the grasshoppers, a plague that hit several counties across Wyoming and devastated crops up and down the valley. The Blackwell fields lost most of the oat crop and half the rye before Oliver and Samuel and Robert, who was 9 and a full and useful working member of the ranch now, managed to turn the cattle and chickens and every available method to the problem. The apple orchard was spared mostly, by virtue of Kate having read about exactly this kind of infestation, and having taken preventive measures in the spring on what had seemed then like overcautious grounds. It was a hard season financially, the hardest since the early years, and Oliver sat at the kitchen table in July with the accounts open and felt, briefly, the ghost of that old Tuesday feeling, the hollow sense of numbers that would not be made to work. Kate sat across from him with her own set of notes, because she kept parallel accounts that were often more detailed than his, and looked at the situation with clear eyes. "The orchard income covers the bank," she said. "The cattle sales in the fall will cover winter. We will not have a surplus this year, but we will not be in debt." "No surplus means no new stock," he said. "No new stock this year," she said, "which is not the same as no new stock." She looked at him, reading his face. "Oliver, we are not where we were in 1882. "I know," he said. "We are two people with a working ranch and a producing orchard and an $800 account balance and good winter preparations and 2 healthy children and Samuel and Clara next door and no debt beyond the ordinary," she said. "A bad crop year is a bad crop year. It is not the end of everything." He held her gaze. "You are right," he said. "I know you are right. I sometimes still, I know," she said. "The ghost of it, that particular fear." She reached across the table and put her hand on his. "It does not get to win any more." He turned his hand and held hers and looked at this woman, his wife of 10 years, this extraordinary, practical, relentless, kind woman who had ridden into his life with seed grain on a mule and never once let him go under since. "No," he said, "it does not." The years settled into their pattern, the pattern of a life that is being well lived, which does not mean without difficulty, but means with purpose and partnership and the accumulation of ordinary graces. Robert grew into a young man of 16 who was already Oliver's equal at most of the ranch work, and who had Kate's way with books, had written to the agricultural college in Laramie about studying there, had received an encouraging response that had been pinned to the door of Kate's book room for 2 months. Eleanor at 13 was quiet and observant, and had begun drawing portraits of the people on the ranch and in town that were startlingly good. Had people at the Henderson place from an itinerant portrait artist who came through Harker's crossing the summer of 1900 and spent a week looking at her work, and said things that made Kate write immediately to her brother in Kansas, who had married a woman with connections to the Denver art community. Oliver watched his children grow and felt the particular deep satisfaction of seeing people become themselves, a satisfaction that had something of grief in it too, the passing of the small versions of them, and something of pride and wonder. He and Kate had a third child, a boy named Harold, after Kate's father, who had died the previous winter at 72 in his Kansas farmhouse. Harold the Younger was born in the early spring of 1897 and was from the beginning a sunny and straightforward child who seemed to have arrived without the complicated inner weather that his siblings carried. And this was both a relief and a source of some amusement to his parents. "He is simply happy," Kate observed, watching Harold at 6 months grinning at a sunbeam on the kitchen floor. "I am not sure where that comes from. Perhaps it skips a generation," Oliver said. She looked at him with raised eyebrows. "Are you saying I am not happy?" "I am saying you are complex," he said carefully. "Which is better?" She considered this. "I will accept that," she said. The ranch by 1897 was a proper going concern, one of the solid mid-sized operations in the valley, not the largest but well-run and reliable, known for the quality of its cattle and for the apple orchard that Kate had turned into something genuinely excellent. Oliver had a reputation in the valley as a straight dealer and a good neighbor, the kind of man that people trusted and came to when they needed something figured out. Kate had a reputation as someone who knew things, which she did, about farming and land and soil and the management of hard times, and younger settlers in the valley frequently sought her out, which she gave time to readily because she remembered what it was to arrive somewhere new with hope and very little else. The valley itself had changed considerably from the early 1880s. Harker's Crossing had grown from a small, rough-edged frontier town into a proper small settlement with a school, 2 churches, a new bank building, a doctor's office, a newspaper, and the full catalog of small commerce that accumulates when enough people decide to stay in a place. The school was important to both Oliver and Kate, who had contributed labor and materials to its construction, and who served on its board, because the education of children was one of those things that Kate felt with particular passion. Robert and Alina and Harold had all gone through it and learned more than Oliver himself had had available as a child. In the summer of 1898, they built a proper porch on the south side of the house, overlooking the orchard, with 2 rocking chairs that became Oliver and Kate's particular spot in the evenings. From that porch you could see the Henderson land too, the fields that had been Kate's before they had become theirs, and on clear days you could see the ridge that gave Ridgeline its name. They sat on that porch on a September evening in 1898, the 2 of them, the children in bed, the harvest done and the accounts closed for the year and the year a good one, with the autumn dark gathering over the orchard and the first stars coming out and the air carrying the particular smell of Wyoming autumn, cold and clean and alive. Oliver was 50 years old. Kate was 43. They had been married 15 years and had 3 children and a ranch that was everything it had ever been meant to be and more. And Oliver looked at the orchard and the fields and the dark line of the ridge and felt the fullness of it settle over him like something that had been a long time coming and had arrived precisely when it was supposed to. "Kate," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her, this woman in her rocking chair, still the most direct person he had ever known, still the person who told him to move over and meant it as a kindness, still the person with the real laugh and the steady gray eyes, a few more lines around those eyes now and some gray in the auburn hair, and the completely intact quality of herself that had not diminished 1 degree in 15 years. "What are you thinking?" she said. He thought about it honestly, because she always deserved his honest answers. "I am thinking about November of 1882, he said, "and about how I was going to go to the bank." She looked at him steadily. And I am thinking that every good thing in my life since that morning is a direct result of you deciding to get on your horse with seed grain on a mule and ride north to a piece of land that needed someone to believe in it." He paused. "I am thinking I have never said thank you properly." She was quiet for a moment. "You say it every day," she said, "in the way you are." "Still," he said, "thank you, Kate." She reached across the space between the chairs and took his hand, warm against the cooling night. "Thank you for moving over," she said. He laughed, and she smiled at him, and the stars came out over the Wyoming ridge and the orchard held its dark fragrant abundance, and the land was theirs, and the night was long and good. They sat like that for a long time, his hand in hers, the autumn quiet around them, not needing to say anything else, because there are some things that have been said thoroughly enough and only need now to be lived. The rocking chairs stayed on that south porch for years, and there were evenings when Robert, home from agricultural college, would find his parents on them in the late evening, and would stand in the doorway a moment before making himself known, watching them sitting together in the dark, and he would feel something he did not have words for exactly, something about the value of staying, about what it looked like when two people had weathered the real weathers and come through to this simple, warm thing. Two people in chairs with their hands nearly touching, watching the stars over a piece of land they had saved together. The land was good. The family was whole. The orchard came in every fall heavy and sweet. Robert eventually took over the ranch management in his late 20s, bringing the college knowledge and his father's patience and his mother's stubbornness to it, and he managed it well. Eleanor went to Denver and studied art and painted all her life, coming back to Wyoming every summer, and the portraits she painted of her parents in the early years of the new century showed them exactly as they were, Oliver and Kate Blackwell, older and weathered and deeply, quietly themselves. Harold grew up into the sunny man he had promised to be as a baby, married a woman named Ruth from the northern part of the valley, and settled on the Henderson land properly his own, farming it with the thoroughness Kate had always brought to it. Samuel and Clara Birch were neighbors and friends all their lives, and when Samuel died in 1911, Oliver was at the grave, and when Clara died 3 years later, Kate was there, and that was how friendships of that kind were kept, all the way to the end. Oliver and Kate grew old together on the Ridgeline Ranch, in the house his father had built with its river stone foundation, and the cottonwood addition, and the east rooms, and the south porch with the rocking chairs. They grew old in the way of two people who have been genuinely at home in each other's presence for a very long time, comfortable and honest and warm. They still argued about things, because they were both people of strong opinion, and the arguments were the good kind, the kind that ended in someone learning something or both of them laughing at themselves. In the autumn of his 67th year, Oliver sat on the south porch in the September evening and thought about the whole arc of it, about a Tuesday in 1882 and a Wednesday morning, and a woman at his gate with seed grain, and he thought that the life that had grown from that Wednesday was the truest thing he had ever been part of. Kate came out with coffee and sat in the other chair and handed him his cup and looked out at the orchard. "The Gravensteins are better this year than last," she said. "They are," he agreed. She looked at him the way she had always looked at him, direct and clear and fully seeing. "You are thinking about that November again," she said. "I am always thinking about that November," he said. She smiled slowly, the private smile, the one that was his. "So am I," she said. The evening settled around them, Wyoming autumn cool and sweet, and the apples in the orchard hung heavy in the last of the light, and the stars were beginning their familiar occupation of the sky. And Oliver Blackwell held his coffee and held everything else besides, the weight and gift of a life that had been worth living, and reached across the arm of his chair to find his wife's hand there waiting for his, warm and certain, and exactly where it always was.